reasonablefaith.org.
Several years ago, I heard the Nobel Prize-winning neurologist, Sir John Eccles, lecture at a World Congress on Philosophy in Dusseldorf, in Germany. And Eccles had just written a book with Sir Karl Popper, one of the greatest philosophers of science during the 20th century, on the self and its brain. And the title is revealing. For Eccles and Popper, the self is not the same as the brain. The self, or what was traditionally called the soul, is a personal, immaterial mental substance, and the brain is a material organ that sits in our cranium. And Eccles and Popper were defending what they called dualism interactionism, that there is an immaterial self which uses the brain as an instrument for thought, as Eccles put it. And he compared the relationship of the self to the brain to that of a pianist to his piano. The piano is an instrument that the pianist uses to play music. And if the instrument is damaged, say out of tune or the strings are broken, then clearly the pianist, though he has the ability to play good music, won't be able to produce music because the instrument that he uses to make music is damaged or incapacitated. And similarly, Eccles said that the self and the brain are related in that way. The brain is an instrument that the self uses to think. And so it's not surprising that when the brain is damaged or confused or perhaps intoxicated or drugged, that the self will not be able to use its instrument for clearly and properly thinking. On this view of the self and the brain, the fact that there are correlations between mental states or conscious states and brain states isn't really surprising. If the self is using the brain as an instrument for thought, then you would expect there to be correlations between mental states and brain states. And when materialists show that there is a brain state that corresponds to, say, the mental state of seeing a yellow patch, that's not really surprising. That hardly proves that materialism is true, that you are your brain, that the self is nothing but the brain. You would expect to see these correlations between the mind and the brain. Now, this past week or so, a doctor, a neurosurgeon from Harvard Medical School, has issued a new book called Heaven is Real, a doctor's experience with the afterlife, in which he relates a near-death experience while he was in a coma. And I think it sheds additional empirical insights on this relationship between the self and its brain. It was the cover story of Newsweek magazine, and let me read you an excerpt from that story. The man's name is Eben Alexander, and this is his testimony. He says, as a neurosurgeon, I did not believe in the phenomenon of near-death experiences. I grew up in a scientific world and became an academic neurosurgeon, teaching at Harvard Medical School and other universities. I understand what happens to the brain when people are near death. And I had always believed there were good scientific explanations for the heavenly out-of-body journeys described by those who narrowly escaped death. In the fall of 2008, however, after 7 days in a coma, during which the human part of my brain, the neocortex, was inactivated, I experienced something so profound that it gave me a scientific reason to believe in consciousness after death. Very early one morning, 4 years ago, I awoke with an extremely intense headache. Within hours, my entire cortex, the part of the brain that controls thought and emotion, and that in essence makes us human, had shut down. Doctors at Lynchburg General Hospital in Virginia, a hospital where I myself worked as a neurosurgeon, determined that I had somehow contracted a very rare bacterial meningitis that mostly attacks newborns. E. coli bacteria had penetrated my cerebrospinal fluid and were eating my brain. When I entered the emergency room that morning, my chances of survival in anything beyond a vegetative state were already low. They soon sank to near non-existent. For 7 days, I lay in a deep coma, my body unresponsive, my higher order brain functions totally offline. There is no scientific explanation for the fact that while my body lay in a coma, my mind, my conscious inner self, was alive and well, while the neurons of my cortex were stunned to complete inactivity by the bacteria that had attacked them. My brain-free consciousness journeyed to another larger dimension of the universe, a dimension I'd never dreamed existed, in which the old pre-coma me would have been more than happy to explain was a simple impossibility. But that dimension, in rough outline, the same one described by countless subjects of near-death experiences and other mystical states, is there. It exists. And what I saw and learned there has placed me quite literally in a new world, a world where we are much more than our brains and bodies, and where death is not the end of consciousness, but rather a chapter in a vast and incalculably positive journey. I'm not the first person to have discovered evidence that consciousness exists beyond the body. Brief, wonderful glimpses of this realm are as old as human history. But as far as I know, no one before me has ever traveled to this dimension, A, while their cortex was completely shut down, and B, while their body was under minute medical observation, as mine was for the full 7 days of my coma. All the chief arguments against near-death experiences suggest that these experiences are the results of minimal, transient, or partial malfunctioning of the cortex. My near-death experience, however, took place not while my cortex was malfunctioning, but while it was simply off. This is clear from the severity and duration of my meningitis and from the global cortical involvement documented by CT scans and neurological examinations. According to current medical understanding of the brain and mind, there is absolutely no way that I could have experienced even a dim and limited consciousness during my time in the coma, much less the hyper-vivid and completely coherent odyssey I underwent. Now, if you're interested in reading about that odyssey, look at the Newsweek article or Eben Alexander's book. But I wanted to give his concluding paragraphs. He says, the plain fact is that the materialist picture of the body and brain as the producers rather than the vehicles of human consciousness is doomed. In its place, a new view of mind and body will emerge, and in fact is emerging already. This view is scientific and spiritual in equal measure, and will value what the greatest scientists of history themselves have always valued above all, truth. This new picture of reality will take a long time to put together. It won't be finished in my time, or even, I suspect, my son's either. I'm still a man of science, every bit as much as I was before I had my experience. But on a deep level, I'm very different from the person I was before, because I've caught a glimpse of this emerging picture of reality. And you can believe me when I tell you that it will be worth every bit of the work it will take us and those who come after us to get it right. The salient point here that I wanted to emphasize was not the veridicality of his experience. That's not the important thing here. I'm not maintaining that he had a veridical experience of the afterlife or that he actually went on such a journey. Maybe it was all an illusion of consciousness, a sort of hallucinatory experience. That's not the point. The point that he's making is that these mental states of consciousness were independent of his brain states, that there wasn't even a correlation like Eccles and Popper thought there would have to be, that here his brain functions were shut down, and yet his mental life, mental states and consciousness was still active and vivid. And it's that disconnect that I thought was so important, not the veridicality of the experience, but rather this showed that there is mind which functions independently of brain states. When I read this testimony, my mind immediately went to a recent book that I have read by Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, called Mind and Cosmos: Why the Materialist, Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Now, Nagel is not a theist, much less a Christian. He is an atheist. Indeed, he is something of an anti-theist. He says, I don't want God to exist. I don't want to live in that kind of a world. He wants atheism to be true. And yet Nagel, just like Eben Alexander, is convinced that the materialist picture of reality is fundamentally flawed and that we cannot adequately take account of this world until we make room for mind and consciousness as equal partners in reality with the physical. Let me just read you a couple of paragraphs from his book. He expresses doubts about whether the reality of such features of our world as consciousness, intentionality, that is being about something, meaning, purpose, thought, and value can be accommodated in a universe consisting at the most basic level of only physical facts. Facts, however sophisticated, of the kind revealed by the physical sciences. So as a philosopher, he's convinced that physicalism or any kind of reality that would say there is no mind beyond the physical cannot account adequately for such features of the world as consciousness, intentionality, meaning, purpose, thought, and value. He goes on to say on page 35, consciousness is the most conspicuous obstacle to a comprehensive naturalism that relies only on the sources of physical science. If we take this problem seriously and follow out its implications, it threatens to unravel the entire naturalistic world picture. And then near the end of the book, on page 128, he says, I would be willing to bet that the present consensus, the present naturalistic, materialistic, physicalistic consensus will come to seem laughable in a generation or two. Though, of course, it may be replaced by a new consensus that is just as invalid. The human will to believe is inexhaustible. And that's the end of the book. So it's so intriguing that a philosopher and a neuroscientist both have come to the conviction that this physicalistic, naturalistic view of the world which prevails in Western academic society is fundamentally flawed, fatally flawed, and will be done away with in the next generation. Wouldn't that be amazing if we were seeing or living at a time where naturalism and physical reductionism is actually on its last legs, despite it seeming to be the dominant paradigm in Western academia, that the next generation will see the unraveling of this naturalistic paradigm. So I thought that was extremely interesting and provides real food for reflection.